It all started on a seemingly ordinary day, but little did I know it would be the beginning of something that would forever alter my sense of right and wrong. My stepbrother Cassian had always been a figure in the background of my life, someone I didn't pay much attention to beyond the usual polite interactions. We shared a household but lived in separate worlds, each caught up in our own routines and interests. I never thought he would become the central figure in a story I'd never dared to tell anyone. That afternoon, I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone while catching up with a friend over a call. We were gossiping about everything and nothing, the way we always did, our laughter echoing through the room. I was relaxed, completely at ease, wearing casual shorts and a tank top, oblivious to the tension simmering in the background. Cassian walked into the room, his presence barely registering at first. He often hovered around, always so casual, so normal, that I didn't think much of it. But as the conversation with my friend carried on, I started noticing little things. The way Cassian's eyes lingered on me longer than usual. The subtle shifts in his posture as he sat down nearby. He was quieter than usual, not cracking his usual jokes or making sarcastic comments. At first, I dismissed it, thinking maybe he was just tired or lost in his thoughts. After all, we all have off days. As I laughed at something my friend said, I felt his gaze on me again. This time it wasn't casual or fleeting, it was intense, almost burning, and it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling. It was like I was being watched in a way I hadn't been before, and it made me uneasy. Still, I didn't say anything. I didn't want to make it awkward, didn't want to overthink things. After all, he was my stepbrother. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was reading too much into a glance, a moment. But deep down, I think I knew something was shifting, even if I wasn't ready to admit it to myself. That day, the dynamic between us started to change, though I couldn't yet put into words how or why. I didn't realize then how much it would spiral out of control, how far things would go, and how much I'd regret not walking away from the couch that very moment. The shift between us became impossible to ignore after that day. It wasn't just a glance here or a brush of his hand there, it was a feeling, an unspoken tension that lingered in the air. Cassian started finding reasons to be closer to me, to be in the same room even when it didn't make sense. He'd sit on the edge of the couch while I watched TV, offer to help me with things he'd never cared about before, or stand too close when we were in the kitchen. Each interaction felt innocent enough to dismiss on the surface, but together they painted a picture I wasn't ready to look at. I kept telling myself that I was imagining it, that he was just being friendly, more attentive, maybe even trying to bond as step-siblings should. But deep down I knew. I felt it every time his arm brushed against mine, every time his gaze lingered just a second too long. It wasn't friendly, it was charged, intense, and it made my stomach twist in ways I couldn't explain. I wanted to say something, to call him out or ask him what was going on, but I didn't. Maybe I was scared of how he'd respond, or maybe I was afraid of acknowledging it myself. One evening, I was sitting on my bed scrolling through social media when Cassian knocked on my door and walked in without waiting for me to respond. It wasn't unusual for him to do that. Boundaries had never been a strong suit for him, but this time felt different. He stood there for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "What's up?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my heart was racing. He shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "Nothing. Just bored." I nodded and went back to my phone, pretending to be engrossed in whatever post was on my screen. But I could feel his presence, the weight of his stare. He sat down on the edge of my bed, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him. "Anything good?" he asked, nodding at my phone. "Just memes," I said, forcing a laugh. He leaned in, as if to see the screen, but his hand brushed against my thigh just for a second, just lightly enough that it could have been an accident. But it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. I knew it wasn't. My breath caught and I froze, unsure of what to do. This wasn't normal. This wasn't okay. But instead of pulling away, instead of saying something, I just sat there, paralyzed by confusion, guilt, and a small, unwelcome thrill that I couldn't ignore. The lines blurred after that night. and everything became a confusing mess of emotions I couldn't untangle. Cassian's behavior didn't just escalate, it became deliberate. He stopped pretending his touches were accidental or his stares were innocent. Instead, he leaned into the tension, testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. The worst part? I let him. I'd like to say I didn't know why, that I was too shocked or overwhelmed to react, but deep down, I think I understood. It wasn't just about him anymore, it was about me too. The small, nagging thrill I felt in those moments grew louder, drowning out the guilt and the voice in my head screaming for me to stop. There was something intoxicating about the way he looked at me, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. It was wrong, I knew it was, but I didn't know how to walk away. The defining moment came one afternoon when I was on the phone with my boyfriend. We were catching up, talking about weekend plans, and I was doing my best to sound normal, like nothing in my life had shifted. Cassian walked into the room halfway through the call, his expression unreadable. He didn't say a word, just sat down beside me on the couch like he belonged there, like this was normal. I tried to ignore him, focusing on the conversation, but it was impossible. He was too close, his knee brushing against mine, his presence consuming the entire space. My heart started racing, not from excitement, but from a strange mix of fear and anticipation. I should have gotten up, walked away, or told him to leave, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen, glued to the spot as my boyfriend's voice filled the silence between us. Cassian didn't stop there. He leaned in closer, his hand trailing down my arm in a way that sent a shiver through me. I couldn't react, couldn't even think straight. My boyfriend was still talking, still oblivious to what was happening on my end. I felt trapped between two worlds, the one I was supposed to be in and the one I was spiraling into. When Cassian's hand slid further, crossing a line I'd never imagined, I felt the weight of my betrayal hit me like a tidal wave. I couldn't believe what I was letting happen, couldn't believe the person I was becoming. I stayed silent, too overwhelmed to stop him and too ashamed to admit how much I'd let myself fall into this. By the time the call ended, I couldn't look at him or myself the same way again. After that day, everything felt different, as though a crack had split my life in two, and I was standing on the fault line, unable to move. I tried to act normal, to go about my days as though nothing had changed, but inside I was unraveling. Every time I saw Cassian, my stomach churned with a mix of guilt, shame, and something darker that I didn't want to name. He acted as though nothing had happened, flashing me his usual smirk, making small talk in the kitchen, and sitting next to me on the couch like he always had. But now every interaction felt loaded, every glance a reminder of the line we'd crossed. I avoided my boyfriend as much as I could, terrified that he'd see the truth in my eyes. When we talked, my voice felt hollow, like I was playing a role instead of being myself. I wanted to confess, to tell him everything, but how could I? How do you admit to betraying someone who trusts you completely, especially when the betrayal doesn't even make sense to you? I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time thing, something I could bury and forget, but the more I tried to push it away, the more it consumed me. Cassian, on the other hand, seemed completely unbothered. If anything, he became bolder. He started finding excuses to touch me, a hand on my shoulder when he passed by, his fingers brushing mine when he handed me something, a lingering graze against my back when no one was looking. Each touch felt like a spark, igniting the tension between us and pulling me deeper into a situation I didn't know how to escape. One night I was sitting alone in the living room, scrolling through my phone and trying to distract myself, when Cassian walked in. He didn't say anything, just sat down next to me, close enough that our thighs were touching. I didn't move, I couldn't. It was as though I was frozen, caught between the urge to pull away and the strange, inexplicable magnetism that kept me rooted to the spot. He leaned in, his arm brushing against mine, and I felt my pulse quicken. I hated myself for it, hated the way my body betrayed me even as my mind screamed at me to stop. But I didn't. I let him sit there, let him touch me, let the silence between us grow heavier with every passing second. It was like I was caught in a web, unable to break free, and with every passing moment the strands tightened, pulling me further into a mess I couldn't undo. The guilt became suffocating after that. Every moment I spent around Cassie and my boyfriend, or even myself, felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I started questioning everything: my choices, my boundaries, and who I had become. This wasn't me. I wasn't the kind of person who crossed lines or betrayed people who cared about me. But no matter how much I hated myself for it, I couldn't seem to stop the spiral. Cassian didn't make it any easier. In fact, he thrived on my conflict, pushing further and testing how far he could go without breaking me completely. His confidence was unnerving, almost as if he knew I wouldn't say no, even if I desperately wanted to. It was like a game to him, a challenge he was determined to win, and I hated how much control he had over the situation and over me. One day, as I was sitting in my room trying to focus on anything but him, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my boyfriend, a simple "I miss you" that felt like a punch to the gut. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with shame. He didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve any of it. I wanted to text back, to reassure him that everything was fine, but the words felt hollow. How could I pretend to be the person he thought I was when I'd become someone I barely recognized? Cassian knocked on my door then, as if he could sense my turmoil. He didn't wait for me to respond before walking in, his usual smirk in place. I froze, my phone still in my hand, the weight of the message heavy between us. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He shrugged, stepping closer. "Just wanted to check on you. You've been quiet lately." I wanted to yell at him, to tell him to leave me alone, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I just sat there, staring at him, my emotions swirling into a storm I couldn't control. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I flinched, pulling back. "Don't," I whispered, my voice trembling. But he didn't stop. He leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto mine, and for a moment, I thought about giving in again, about letting myself get pulled under one more time. But then I thought about my boyfriend, about the person I used to be before all of this, and something inside me snapped. I stood up abruptly, stepping away from him. "You need to leave," I said, my voice steadier now. He looked at me, surprised but unbothered, as if he didn't believe I meant it. But I did. For the first time since this started, I felt like I had control again, even if it was just a small piece of it. As he left the room, I sat back down, my heart pounding. I knew I wasn't out of the mess yet, but I also knew I couldn't keep living like this. It was time to face the truth, to confront the mistakes I'd made, and to figure out how to move forward, even if it meant losing everything in the process.